Next on PJ Radio's The Unconventionals.
It's a real rush. Like you make something and it's like, that's mine. I made that. I know how that works. I mean, that came out of my machine. Okay, this is mine.
Yeah.
And then you can give it to somebody. You're like, I made that. And they're like, you made it? And you're like, yeah, on my 3D printer, on my MakerBot. Bam.
I love this opening quote because it captures a sense of transformation when a person becomes a maker that comes when we get a 3D printer in our hands. It also captures the personality of Bre Pettis, the founder and CEO of MakerBot. Sure, he runs MakerBot the company, but what really gets Bre excited is where this technology is heading and how it is already changing things. Most people have heard of 3D printers by now, even if very few have one in their homes. Most applications have been commercial to date. In fact, a few weeks ago, NASA successfully tested a rocket engine injector that was built with a 3D printer. MakerBot and Bre Pettis are credited with bringing the technology to the consumer market. So a quick definition of 3D printing. 3D printers take a CAD drawing, computer-aided design drawing, and recreates that drawing as a three-dimensional thing. It does this by adding tiny layers of material, plastic for the most part, till the object is complete. If you haven't seen one at work, it's very cool. We have a video on the Unconventionals Facebook page that you can check out. I met with Bre Pettis at the MakerBot headquarters in Brooklyn. Here is Bre on the extremely accelerated arc of the business. In 3 years, going from a one-man show with 20 kit-built 3D printers to the cover of Wired magazine.
I started a thing called NYC Resistor, which gathered the smartest people in New York to share a really wonderful workshop with lots of tools. And, when you can make anything, we thought, well, let's make a machine that can make anything.
That's a nice start. So that's a founding insight at some point, right? And,
at first it was a project and we got it started. We got some seed funding from some friends and we made 20 kits. And I went to Austin, went to South by Southwest.
What year is this?
This is 2009, okay. So like March of 2009. And, it was basically a prototype that just so happened to work, so we were going to ship it. And went to South by Southwest, kind of did a tour, like opened for bands and, set up at bars making shot glasses and stuff. And it was just one of those things that was like, here, I have a new technology. Here, internet, look. And, we put it on the internet and we thought, okay, well, we'll make 20 of these kits and it'll last a couple of months. And then while these are selling, we'll make more. And we sold out basically instantly. So it took us, we were behind, demand exceeded supply for about 4 years. And we just moved into a new manufacturing space. It's like, finally I got tired of just doubling and having that not be enough. So I was like, screw it. We're going to grow by a factor of 10. We moved from a 5,000 square foot manufacturing facility into a 50,000 square foot manufacturing facility in South Brooklyn.
And that's just this year?
Yep, that's just a few...
And you
2 months ago.
And you were back at South by Southwest this spring, and I imagine you weren't walking around the bars making shot glasses, or maybe you were.
When I did it the first time, it was very like under the radar. I didn't buy a ticket; I just went to the bars. This time, I gave the opening keynote and got to launch our next product, the MakerBot Digitizer, just a desktop 3D scanner, in that keynote. So that was a nice little bookends there to be like, okay, here, check. Cross that marker, onward.
This is not your typical technology startup story where a guy has an idea, gets some venture capital, and commercializes a business. 3D printing is much more like the open source software movement in the late 1980s. Linux and the idea of open source code started first. Efforts to commercialize followed. 3D printing had been around for a while among do-it-yourself types, and like Linux, the early inspiration was to keep 3D printing open source. Lots of people were doing it at a project level, soldering together their own machines or trying to find time on industrial machines. The question is who could catalyze these community efforts into a startup, move 3D printing from project to product. It would take an uncommon mix of skills to create a consumer product, but also keep the promise of open source, that we're all in this together, that we're creating something really important intact. Well, it turns out Bre Pettis was the man for the job. His combination of skills, community organizer, geek, entrepreneur, and a few others, were all required to make this happen. So listen to Bre talk about his background, which sounds honestly like a parody of the liberal arts major. It prepared him perfectly for moving 3D printing out of the garage and into Amazon.com, where you can buy a replicator or two for about $2,000 today. So you're not an engineer?
I'm a tinkerer.
Yeah. And what was your college in, and what did you...
So when I was a kid, I thought, when I grew up, I want to be a mechanic. I really liked working on bikes and fixing things. And I still, my first car I got, and it was broken, and I didn't get to drive it till it was fixed. So, and I probably had about 30 cars. So I actually, because I've always, only really one car was, two cars were worth more than $1,000. So I've gone through a lot of hoopties, and, my routine was for a long time like, okay, I have a car. It's working right now. Great. And then it would not work. And I'd have to decide, is the fix going to cost more than $500? Because if so, I should probably just get a new car.
Yeah.
And so I just grew up a tinkerer.
Yeah.
And, knowing that when something's broken, you have to figure out how to fix it, or you better move on.
Yeah.
So then I went to college. I went to the Evergreen State College, which was great for me. It's a liberal arts college on the West Coast. Very hippie in a way. There's no grades.
Yeah.
You just have to have a certain amount of credits. You can study whatever you want. And that was great. I mean, I think so many people kind of try and nail themselves down into a career before they've actually figured out what they don't like.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I was there for 5 years. I was on the 5 year of the 4 year program. At Evergreen, you basically study one thing at a time. So, and it's a whole program. So for the first year, I was in a program called Problems Without Solutions, which studied Northern Ireland, Israel, Palestine, and South Africa, all of which were in major churn.
Yeah.
And, my second year I was in a program called Learning and Power, which was all about how people think and how people learn, educational theory, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that was great. And then I got into the third year, I spent half the year in Japan. And in my last 2 years, I ended up doing ethnomusicology and Buto dance. So I ended up and then when I was done, I had a month from when I was done till I graduated, and I got into puppetry. And then when I graduated, I ended up working my way into a job at Jim Henson's Creature Shop in Prague. Before I even knew what country Prague was in.
You're not having me on, are you?
No. And then that was cool. And I say yes to things. People are like, do you want to go, do you want to work on a movie? And I'm like, yes. And do you have a problem with it being abroad? And I'm like, no, let's do this thing.
In the early days of MakerBot, Bre would be saying yes to a lot of things. Certainly some of them had to do with running the business and building product, and his background as a tinkerer would certainly serve him well. But it also meant building the industry, convincing people that a future where everyone has a 3D printer on their desk is a future worth investing in. I asked him how he balances growing the industry with running the company.
Spreading the word is interesting. We've done a couple things startups should do. One, when we started the company, I would go out and drink in the community, go to events and meet people and make friends and make connections and tell people about what we were doing and learn about what other people were doing and find ways of working together with people. And then running the business, there was, when we started with 3 people, it was just, we did everything.
Yeah.
And we had to fill in for each other and make stuff happen and pack boxes and print out labels and build infrastructure.
So do you feel like you'd rather do one versus the other? I mean, I know you can't really choose at this point. Are you built to do one versus the other? Do you see yourself doing both?
I get my hands pretty dirty.
Yeah.
I believe people with dirty hands are right,
Yeah.
I poke around in the R&D department pretty heavy. I poke around in product. They present to me and I go, well, let's take it the next step farther, quite a lot. And the great thing is, when we started, it was just us figuring out we were not engineers, and the machine reflected that, and it needed a lot of help, and a lot of our users gave it to us. Now I actually get to work with, I have a team of probably 80 engineers out there who are all they worked on radar systems in the space shuttle. They worked on just amazing. I get to work with the coolest people in the world and push things farther.
We talked earlier about the open source roots of 3D printing, and a lot of that was about keeping the designs for hardware and software open and free. MakerBot has kept the spirit alive and extended the principle of openness in important ways through the Thingiverse, a crowdsourced site of digital designs that can be 3D printed, that are all open and available and free. Here's Bre on the Thingiverse.
So Thingiverse.com is something we started in 2008 before MakerBot. And we were making things on our laser cutter and using digital designs. And we were fussing with the 3D printer. And we needed a place to share digital designs. We were like, you can download music, you can download movies, you can download books, but why can't you download things? So we looked around and everything that was out there to download things was just crappy. So we, on a Saturday, Zach Smith and I started Thingiverse.
Was that a conscious effort to say, hey, we need some infrastructure to build an industry, or is that more practical than that?
It was more like we were losing files on hard drives were dying. So we needed to have a cloud solution for things.
Yeah.
That was part of it. And then the other one was just, we told people hey, there should be a place where you can download things. And they were like, yeah, cool. Where? And we were like, okay, there should be a universe of things. What should we call it?
It may sound like something from Dr. Seuss, but Thingiverse contains close to 100,000 designs. Google Thingiverse, check it out. It's a strange and fascinating place, a bazaar of 3D designs that ranges from action figures to the awe-inspiring. There are lots of plastic tchotchkes for sure, but also totally transformative creations like prosthetic hands. More on that a bit later. And if miniature Queen Anne's furniture is your thing, you'll find plenty of chairs, couches, and lamps from Pretty Small Things, which is the business started by Casey Holmgren. Casey is a set designer by trade who started out making scale models by hand, one-off and painstakingly. She now designs and builds on a MakerBot replicator. Pretty Small Things is a great example of 3D printing's potential for long-tail markets. The small, enthusiastic group of collectors who will gladly pay her for 3D printed furniture is not big enough to justify a traditional manufacturing process of injection molds and production at scale. We asked Casey to talk about how she used Thingiverse.
When I first started 3D printing, I actually didn't intend to share my files online. But I felt like, I'm doing this cool stuff. I really wanted to share it. I wanted some feedback from other people, some pro tips on, how to make my results better. And so I posted that first design. And I sort of got hooked on the sharing concept. This idea of sharing your design and your intellectual property online was not something that I was very familiar with as a designer and as an artist. But after posting a couple designs online and then waking up the next morning and having people who printed those designs in Japan and Taiwan and Australia upload their photos of my work, it was sort of incredible. And I was sort of just hooked on this idea of sharing the work. And so these days I sort of walk a line between sharing and then maintaining some of my designs. I think sharing that work with other people is part of what I think makes 3D printing exciting.
Do you worry that Thingiverse undermines your business or maybe undersells your IP and your designs?
I'm interested to see how all of this plays out over the next few years, because I think there are other 3D printing marketplaces that are trying to promote selling of digital designs. The truth is I would prefer not to be in distribution. I would prefer to be selling design files and not design objects. But the infrastructure for that isn't quite there yet, and most of the people who are buying my products don't have a 3D printer at home. If we get to a place where the density of 3D printing is such that the people who want my products can buy my digital files and create the copies themselves, that's amazing, and that's actually the world I really want to live in, because distribution is kind of a pain.
When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Bre Pettis, founder and CEO of MakerBot. We'll talk with Bre about some forward-thinking ways people are using 3D printers, ways that challenge the perception that a 3D printer is just a glorified trinket machine. We'll also debrief with David Rogers, Executive Director of the Center on Global Brand Leadership at Columbia Business School. That's coming up after the break on PJA Radio's The Unconventionals.
You're listening to PJ Radio's The Unconventionals. If you'd like to learn more about the show or join in on the conversation, check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/unconventionalsradio. Our academic sponsor for the Unconventionals is the Center on Global Brand Leadership at Columbia Business School, which turns the research of academia's foremost thinkers on branding into practical tools and insight for real-world application. For more information, visit globalbrands.org.
Welcome back to PJA Radio's The Unconventionals. Our guest this week is Bre Pettis, founder and CEO of MakerBot. Our mission at The Unconventionals is to find disruptive thinkers and companies. So how is MakerBot changing the world? It started with rethinking manufacturing, taking it from the high capital, high scale world of mass production to something we can all do. It's also about being, as Bre says, a force for goodness. So what exactly does he mean by this? It's easy enough to focus on the novelty of 3D printing or the fact that a lot of what's printed is plastic trinkets. But there's plenty of game-changing going on, especially in healthcare. One of the things that I know I've read about you and read about the companies, you want to be a force for good.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
So we're dedicated to creating tools for creative explorers to change the world. For example, we just did a project called the RoboHand Project. And there's a guy in South Africa who lost some of his fingers in his trade. And when he was in the hospital, he was like, I'm going to build myself a new hand. And he started working with a guy in Seattle who makes props for theater. And we gave each of these guys a MakerBot, and they used them as like 3D printing fax machines. And they would just send ideas, like every 20 minutes they could send an idea back and forth and, start innovating. And they made a hand for the guy, and it's great. And then they started realizing there's a thing called amniotic band syndrome, which is basically people that are born without fingers. You have a palm but no fingers or thumb. And they decided to take it the next step and make one for this kid. Now they basically are just deluged with requests, and they put the designs up on Thingiverse. And now if you need a hand, or you have a kid who needs fingers, or you know somebody who would benefit from one of these, you just get a MakerBot and make one for them. And it's, when a finger can cost $10,000, the plastic for a whole hand costs you like $2.50. So that's the main problem with kids and prosthetics is they grow. Like it's like shoes, except the shoes cost $10,000. Like you can't do that. So when a robo hand costs like $2.50 plus some nuts and bolts and string, it changes the game. It makes it so that, literally by owning the means of production, you're like making something possible that was impossible before.
What would you make if you could make anything? By this time in the interview, I was certainly asking myself this question. Chris Anderson, former editor of Wired magazine, recently wrote a book called Makers, The New Industrial Revolution. Here's how he talks about the maker movement. The desire to make things with our hands is deeply rooted, but during the past century, the era of mass production, our tinkering in workshops and garages and kitchens was a solitary hobby rather than a true economic force. That is changing. The world of do-it-yourself has gone digital, and like everything else that goes digital, it's been transformed. So the story of the RoboHands project starts to give you the sense of the transformative power of 3D printing. I talked to Bre about how MakerBot's mission will change not just how we manufacture things, but how we create and innovate. He starts with his own experience as a kid.
In 1981, my family had a software company called Software Productions, and we made children's software. So I was 9, and I had access to an Apple II Plus, a Commodore 64, and an Acorn, which was kind of an Apple knockoff. What I got out of having computers at that age was because I was around programmers and hackers who were my heroes as a kid. I learned how to, when I was playing Wizardry, I learned how to give myself a bajillion gold points and a Cuisinart blade that was undefeatable. And, things like that where you get to play games and then change the game, like I feel like I got a real leg up as a kid by having access to that technology. And I think the kids of today, it's a similar thing. Like the kids of today who grew up with MakerBots are just going to be able to manifest ideas in a way that other kids won't be able to. And so it gives them a leg up. I think that there's also a similarity of like when we started, there were just mainframe size machines. And it was like the mainframe days. Like if you wanted to use one, you had to sneak in on the weekend and get your hands on one. And even then it was pretty dicey. So when we started, there were just mainframe 3D printers, like bigger than refrigerator size 3D printers. And And we were like, okay, let's make it so this sits on your desk. Let's do the desktop thing. And, who knows? Maybe someday we'll have the laptop version of a MakerBot. But I think actually we're in a pretty sweet spot in terms of size and in terms of what you can make with it. But, we're still at the beginning. There's still a lot of work to be done just to build awareness. There's a lot of interesting work to be done around what you can make with it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be bored with 3D printing for decades. There's so much to do.
Well, and I think there's another question in there too, which is the pioneers in the industry aren't always, or maybe often aren't the people who end up winning that market when it crosses over. And is this a different market than 2D printers or PCs in some important ways?
I think in some ways, because the industry had been bottled up for 20 years, locked up in patents and stuff like this, they were really focused on the industry side of things. We were able to kind of bust in and be like, okay, 3D printers for everyone. And that's just a different game. So I'm sure the game will change more as we go forward. But for now, it's good times.
And you like where you are.
We make a desktop 3D printer that is awesome. It's reliable. It looks good. It makes high quality models. It's just something really special. So we're in a good spot.
There's not a bunch of consumers out there that already know what 3D printing is and are looking to buy one. You do have to make that market. And even in the transitions you've talked about, you've gone from room-sized machines to machines that had to be put together by engineers. So what are you guys doing to try to make this available for anybody? How is that effort going?
It's an ongoing effort to make this available to everybody. When we started, our first kits were kits. They took sometimes 30 or 40 hours to put together. And the first 200 people who got a MakerBot, they didn't get electronics to plug into. They got a circuit board and a sandwich baggie full of components. And some tweezers and a thing that you put over your head that had magnifying glasses on it, and you squeeze solder paste onto it in the right spots and put the electronic parts on with tweezers, and then you stuck it in a toaster oven. That was making it available when we started. Yeah. So since then we've gone and the electronics became fully assembled, and then next thing you know, at the tail end of the Thing-O-Matic, we started assembling those and selling and we assembled and sold them. And then with the Replicator that came out in January of 2012, that's a fully assembled machine. And now the Replicator 2, it's just obvious that it's a fully assembled, comes in a box. You take it out, you plug it in, you put the SD card in, and you start printing stuff out. So it's come a long way. I mean, there's still those guys and gals who got those early machines who are like, oh, you have a problem connecting the USB cord? I walked to school both ways with no shoes, surface mount electronics myself, blah, blah, blah. So it's our mission is to empower as many people as possible to use this technology, to be empowered, to feel the raw power of having a MakerBot and get the rush of making things. It's a real rush. You make something and it's like, that's mine. I made that. I know how that works. That came out of my machine. Okay, this is mine. Yeah. And then you can give it to somebody. You're like, I made that, and they're like, you made it? And you're like, yeah, on my 3D printer, on my MakerBot. Bam.
Let's stay with this topic a bit longer. I mean, we incorporate new technology into our lives all the time, and rarely is it truly transformative. So I asked Bre to go a little bit deeper, make the connection between the pervasiveness of 3D printers and how this changes the discovery process. The ability to iterate quickly and easily and concretely is critical.
Yeah, we wanted it to fit on your desk, be friendly on your desk, so that the old way of 3D printing is if you have 3D printers, they're in a glass room and you have to swipe your card in there and book your time and all this kind of stuff. We wanted it to just sit on your desk so you can just have it, make stuff. And if you're an engineer, you can make stuff, and if you don't like it, you can just throw it away and not even have to show your boss. Make another one. So that kind of iteration, that iteration is super important. Iteration, the ability to do it again really quickly, the ability to look at it and just iterate is it's the core of the MakerBot as the innovation engine. That ability to just crush out designs and make changes and crush out more just means that you get to better products faster. You get your idea out and you can work on it more.
Yeah.
I was just at Edison's lab over in Jersey, and he was working on rubber. We didn't have rubber trees naturally, and it was a problem. And so he wanted to make synthetic rubber. And he started testing plants. And how many plants do you think he tested till he found
500.
17,000. And for each of these things, he had to test it, crush it up, make it into a powder, cook it, mush it.
That's like the 99% perspiration part of it.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
Right.
And then when he gets it, he figures out, okay, goldenrod. Goldenrod's what you use to make latex. He takes it the next step, and because goldenrod, when he started, was only like 3 feet high, they go ahead and they spend a bunch of time like cross-pollinating it, and they get it so goldenrod can be like 12 feet tall. And so that when you grow it, you grow like massively more. So it's not just, it's that kind of like brute force innovation of like, we're going to figure this out. Bang, 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 until you like literally like your head wears a hole in the wall.
Right.
And you can bust through it.
So what if Edison had a 3D printer? That's a fun thought. Huh?
I think what if I had a 3D printer when I was 10? Like, what if I could just take one of these things and like, put it in a DeLorean and send it back to 1982? That would be like, the world would be different if I had just had one, because I would have had this tool. I would have been able to innovate faster, earlier, and learn so much more about how to make things so earlier in life. So,
well, and I suppose that you use yourself as an example. It doesn't have to just be the Edisons of the world. It's all of us, right? I mean, if this...
Yeah, it's an innovation machine. Like Edison needed a factory of 15,000 people to execute on his ideas. And that's been the model until recently. Like, if you want to make something, you need to basically have a really good idea that like 100,000 people are willing to buy, or you need to be a tycoon, or there's just not many opportunities for people who aren't tycoons to make stuff on a big scale and to innovate. And now with a MakerBot, you for the price of a really nice laptop with some of the boxes checked, you can get a MakerBot and have that on your desk and start pushing something forward. And
you're an optimist. It sounds like I talk to you, and you're an optimist.
It's not worth spending any time on things that don't have potential. And when you find things that have potential and you start pushing energy into it, interesting things happen. I mean, I think that's the approach here, is like, let's explore. When something sparkles, let's dig deeper.
Shortly after I sat down with Bre, MakerBot was acquired by Stratasys, a leader in commercial 3D printing, for $400 million. The early reaction to the deal is positive in the 3D printing community. The companies complement each other nicely, and Stratasys will give MakerBot the resources it needs to grow and compete. But it's clear after talking to Bre that so much of MakerBot's value is based on the bigger vision: 3D printers on everyone's desk, driving a whole wave of businesses like Pretty Small Things and innovations like the RoboHands project. A lot of this, it seems to me, is dependent on protecting the ethic of openness and community, which is a lot harder to do as the market and money gets big. I talked to David Rogers for perspective. David is executive director of the Center on Global Brand Leadership at Columbia Business School. I started by asking him if he thought the consumer 3D printing market would look a whole lot different if, say, HP was the pioneer rather than MakerBot.
Absolutely. They would not have taken such a community-driven, certainly not an open source kind of approach. And that's really interesting pattern that I'm seeing because I look a lot at customer networks and their value to different companies. And I see different industries where you've got some more traditional players that sort of build their assets and their value to the marketplace in a traditional way, where they're holding everything as close as possible. And then you have these other companies that are following, in this case, the MakerBot model, where a lot of the value of the enterprise, it's not so much about patents, intellectual property, and such things. A lot of the value is in the connections, the network of people, and the values that are shared and their connection to each other. And so you see some acquisitions recently. Waze, the mapping platform that's been bought by Google. Tumblr, the primarily visual blogging site, acquired by Yahoo. In both these cases, you have companies where a lot of the value is really inherent in the folks who are using it, the community of users. Waze, the whole value of the mapping system is about how people who are using it are voluntarily contributing real-time information to create data and information on what route you should take in real-time traffic conditions is even more accurate than anything Google has been able to create. Well, if Google, turns off that community, if they do something that disengages them, well, the whole value of the acquisition has disappeared. So they've been very careful to announce immediately that they were keeping Waze separate, at least to start, and wanting to, support and continue the kind of community that's been built up. Yahoo gave the same kind of Mercenaire, gave the same kind of signal early on. So it's a challenge. Can you merge these two business models? It may be a little easier with Stratasys and MakerBot because since Stratasys has focused on the commercial side of 3D printing, you're not sort of merging two exactly parallel product lines, so it's maybe even easier to keep the two business sides somewhat sort of running in parallel for a while.
David Rogers is the executive director of the Center on Global Brand Leadership at Columbia Business School. He joined us from his offices in New York City. Special thanks this week to Casey Holkgren. For more information on her company, Pretty Small Things, visit prettysmallthings.com. Tune in again next month when we sit down with Michael Browner of Unreal Candy, the Massachusetts company with a mission of reinventing candy by taking all the unreal stuff out.
The Unconventionals is written and produced by Mike O'Toole with Reed Mangan. Post-production and technical direction by Reed Mangan with Emmanuel Ording. Promotions, distribution, and social strategy by Greg Strafface and Graham Spector. Our creative director is Aaron De Silva. Our executive producer is Phil Johnson for PJA Advertising and Marketing. I'm Jafia Leahy. To hear more episodes of The Unconventionals, visit pjaradio.com.